It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce you two of my great colleagues and friends, I would say. First in a row is going to be Alenka Zupančič, who... Is that okay? Who works... who is a senior advisor at the Institute of Philosophy of the Research Center here in Ljubljana and professor at the European Graduate School in SAZU in Switzerland. I know Alenka is somebody who is very well known worldwide and does not need a special introduction, but still she's the author of many books, of which I would say each of her books like open up a particular path of research, and it was kind of might be considered as a kind of opening up the space for further research that has been done. Like the book on Lacan and Kant, the ethics of the real, not to talk about the one on comedy. Two of most recent books, and I believe the same is going to be with these two books, are the one on Antigone, Let Them Rot, who came out 2 years ago with Fordham University Press, and one that is just about to come out with Polity Press. It's titled Disavowal. And Alenka's today talk, it's gonna be, there is a title, Is the Logic of Fantasy the Lacanian Transcendental? ? The floor is yours, Alenka.
Thank you very much, Boštjan. And of course, also I would like to thank everyone who actually made this conference conception. Come. Go? Okay. Who made this conference possible, both imagining it and then realizing it concretely. Some of you were here the first edition of this conference. I then spoke about the Lacanian reading or reinterpretation of the cogito in the seminar Logic of Fantasy. And this paper is a kind of in continuity with this, although shifting the focus principally on the question of fantasy as it works, the concept of fantasy as it operates in Lacan. And I have to admit that I'm slightly anxious today because I think that this presentation will be something of a tightrope walk. Namely, the goal that I set myself, what I want to argue for, is rather ambitious. And if I would, in order to make a really solid argument for this thesis, I think I would need much more time. So I had to try to reduce this paper to, let's say, the unnullable list, to just kind of keeping crucial things that still will hopefully hold the argument up, not letting it slide in some kind of gibberish or else in some kind of pure abstraction, although the paper will definitely be speculative in its nature. And perhaps I will simply give you the gist of my kind of central thesis in advance, hopefully not as a spoiler, but as a point of orientation, because precisely of this, tightrope effort that I will try to pull off. So the gist of my thesis would be the following. The same thing that makes possible the formations of the unconscious also makes possible objective scientific knowledge. The same thing that allows the formations of the unconscious to occur also allows, let's say, objective scientific knowledge or knowledge to exist. Okay, in the first step, I propose to distinguish between two conceptual levels of the term fantasy in Lacan. One is the level at which fantasy is a constitutive element or simply constitutive of reality, a support for reality. It is something practically synonymous with reality. It is what makes reality something we can relate to and make an object of this or that thing, but also of knowledge. So when Lacan says that reality is phantasmatic, he does not mean that it is unreal or imagined or something like this. The suggestion is philosophically much more ambitious and far-reaching, and I actually read it, and I think Lacan also clearly states this at some point, as nothing less than a significant, perhaps, twist on what Kant called the transcendental constitution of reality or transcendental schematism also. Okay, and then there is another level of fantasy, another way in which this term is used, which comes closer to the common usage, but also, of course, to what Freud analyzed as fantasy. Fantasy as a peculiar scene, peculiar scenario, particular phrase that fascinates us, captivates us, and so on. So these are two quite different levels, but they are not unrelated. Today, I really want to concentrate on the first one, on how fantasy functions as a constitutive support for our reality, and on what this means for the possibility of what we call objective knowledge, or perhaps knowledge as truth. So let's say the Freudian aspect of fantasy or discussion will not really come into this consideration today, but I think Freudian perspective will be present in another discussion related to what I will be talking about, which is also related to the first panel of this conference, namely the question of reality testing and loss of reality, if you want. So this is more the way, if you want to bring Freud in, which I won't discuss here explicitly, would be more related to this than to the concept of fantasy. How the two levels or the two concepts relate, it's another question. I have some thoughts on it, but I won't go into this today. So Lacan uses two important terms when discussing fantasy: window and frame. Fantasy is that which frames reality. We could say posits it as existing vis-a-vis the subject who sees it, thinks it, knows something about it, something around it. This vis-a-vis, or we could also call it correlation, is the essence of fantasy. And in this sense, fantasy is essentially the fantasy, we could say, of the relationship or correlation between the subject of possible knowledge and what is, let's say, out there, to put it very simply, what we call reality. To be more precise, it is not so much the fantasy of this relation, but rather fantasy as the relation between the subject and reality. It is not that we as subjects fantasize about this relation, but rather fantasy is the very structure, the form of this correlation or relation in which we find ourselves. Fantasy is that which provides an opening to reality. It does not simply refer to what we see there through its window or frame, but refers, we could say, to the window, the frame itself. This definition or description corresponds to what we could call the fundamental mode of fantasy, fantasy as reality, or simply fantasy as correlation, fantasy that we do not even recognize as fantasy, but as a normal, ordinary state of things. In this sense, fantasy does indeed have something in common with the Kantian notion of the transcendental, as several interpreters have already pointed out. It is in a way the condition of possibility of our experiencing the world, relating to it, and so on. It is one with constitution of what we perceive as reality, and of course with the constitution of the subject. Now, explaining the difference, discussing precisely these things, explaining the difference between his psychoanalytic perspective and the philosophical, especially Kantian perspective involving transcendental categories, and the distinction between phenomena and noumena, Lacan writes, this is from Seminar 11, "For us, it is not this dialectic between the surface and that which is beyond, for us, it is not in these dialectics between the surface and that which is beyond that things are suspended. For our part, we set out from the fact that there is something already in nature that creates a rupture, a bipartition, a splitting, schism, of the being to which the being accommodates itself." Okay, it's a dense passage, but here is, let's say, my reading of it. This schism, this splitting, implies that the subject, we could start saying it, putting it like this, that the subject appears on both sides of the frame of fantasy, as represented in the schema, which I will now ask the technical people there to put on, as seen in this schema of the scopic register that Lacan draws in the context of the same discussion. It's just like one paragraph away from the quote that I just read to you. So the subject of representation on the one side, the gaze on the other side. And of course, the gaze is not something that we see the screen, the image. The gaze is, so to say, excluded. So there is no symmetry, no relation, no correlation here between the subject of representation and the gaze. Or you could say the relation in question is actually that of mutual exclusion, an either-or with which Lacan defines the structure, as you know well, of both alienation and also the fundamental structure of the cogito. We saw this the last time, either I am or I think, or I am where I don't think, and so on. So the gaze is not a correlate of the subject of representation or knowledge, but rather the marker of that which necessarily falls out, disappears with the constitution of the subject in its correlation to reality. This would be one simple way of putting it. So what happens at the level of the constitution is a constitutive split, a split of the subject, a split between what emerges as the subject of knowledge or representation and the subject as lack, as the gap left in reality when, so to say, the subject moves from its emergence in reality to a point, in a way, opposite vis-à-vis reality. The something in nature that creates a rupture is precisely the blind spot that marks this ontologically impossible place of the subject in reality. As the subject of my thoughts, the one who has them, I can only appear elsewhere, vis-à-vis reality. But this kind of transcendental condition also leaves a trace in reality in itself, in the form of its rupture, precisely. And this rupture is objective. It has an objective existence, so to speak. So let me reiterate this in yet another way. The constitution of the subject of knowledge about reality and posited in relation to reality coincides with the constitution, with the installation, with the appearance of a hole or gap in that same reality. And this is one and the same moment, because the hole is ultimately nothing other than the frame, the window through which we relate to reality. It is not a whole to see, but a whole as a condition for us to see anything out there at all. But such a thing as a hole or gap can also appear and be seen within reality as points of its discontinuity, or as points at which the lacking subject, the subject as lacking precisely, unexpectedly appears within the frame, usually in the form of a surplus impossible object blurring the picture. Is disturbed the picture, sometimes threatens to break it down. Now, Mladen Dular suggested a very nice and vivid image, an example of such a thing happening. I quote, "But imagine that one could see one's mirror image close its eyes." So we look at it and we see the image close its eyes. That would make the object as gaze appear in the mirror. End of quote. So if this were to happen, it would actually shatter, we could say, our window fantasy or the frame of this mirror. It would cause reality to collapse and the subject to lose its bearings, to be swallowed by anxiety. This object gaze is nothing other than the impossible appearance of the subject on the other side, on the side of reality, where it is not precisely, or more precisely, where it exists only as a lack, as a disappearance. If I appear there, I must necessarily disappear here, or a subject of representation, knowledge, and this is a kind of existential anxiety similar to that involved in the phenomena of the doppelganger, the double, because as you probably know, it is also when my double appears, it is also the double that has more reality than myself. I start fading out. But these kind of drastic, dramatic examples of Realitätsverlust or loss of reality are not the only ways in which this kind of phantasmatic constitution of reality manifests itself or betrays itself. There are also less threatening forms, we could say, in which the cracks in this reality appear and reveal something of the negativity or subtraction involved in its constitution, in the constitution of reality. And these are precisely what psychoanalysis associates with the formations of the unconscious, the symptoms above all, slips of the tongue, dreams, and so on. Discontinuities. A symptom is a solution that points to a problem and in which the problem remains operative, so to speak. It is a form of discontinuity. The formations of the unconscious both signal a problem and deal with it, respond to it. They take place as a solution to the impasse caused precisely by these cracks in fundamental fantasy. This is why the formations of the unconscious are not entirely subjective, precisely, reducible to a mere subjective pathology or distortion. They maintain a kind of vital connection with reality and its ruptures, which again I claim are objective. This is to say, beyond individual pathologies and their articulations, something more general and structural appears with these formations. Something that is not simply caused by this or that particular pathology, but rather explains the possibility of pathology as such and directs, or let's say mental illness as such, and directs our attention from the subject to something in reality. So in what follows, I will now focus on the relationship between the, let's say, this fundamental fantasy as reality, as a frame of reality, and the symptoms that kind of attempt to master the anxiety that signals the real as the precisely inherent limit of the given reality in obviously very different ways. As you also probably know, at least some of you, Lacan discusses this relationship through the example of the famous Freudian case of the Wolfman, Sergei Pankeyev, Freud's patient, who later became known as the Wolfman, had a nightmare in which he dreamt that he was lying in bed. This was a dream. He was lying in bed in his dream when the window suddenly swung open. He looked out, he saw 6 or 7 white wolves sitting in the tree outside the bedroom, their eyes fixed on him. So this dream, which induces a strong anxiety that will kind of dominate several years of Wolfman's life, stages, as it were, the relationship between fantasy as a window onto reality and the real, and then the real which is excluded from this reality and from its transcendental framework in order for it to have some consistency, but this real nevertheless reappears within this frame in the form of a kind of shattering and anxiety-provoking event. And the fact that this happens within a dream, we could say, is precisely what prevents it from sliding all the way to some kind of Realitätsverlust. So Lacan comments on this dream, just one very brief quote. It is not only that the subject is fascinated by the sight of these wolves, it is their fascinated gaze, it is that their fascinated gaze is the subject himself. What exactly does this mean? And does it mean that the gaze simply is him, the Wolfman? Well, yes and no. It is not about any kind of mirroring or projection or possible recognition. And perhaps this point is difficult, but it is absolutely crucial. It suggests both that the subject of the unconscious, is out there, and that it is not out there as one thing among others, as this or that object or subject or person, any kind of being appearing in reality, in this case, in the reality of this dream. Rather, it is there as the point at which reality looks back at me, cracks open, so to say, with this instance of the gaze. In other words, what is at stake here is precisely my relation as a subject to the reality I inhabit. And by relation here, I don't mean something like a subjective relation depending on my psychology, but an objective and constitutive relation. So it is not enough to say, as for instance in the classical psychological perspective, that what comes to me as if from outside is in fact my own self or some projection of my own self. I think one must add that if something of myself comes to me from the outside and surprises me, even shatters me, it is because there is something in the structure of this outside itself that makes it possible. It is not simple as that kind of projection theory. Because there is in fact something of myself that dwells outside of me, that is in what I perceive as the outside, as not me, as the reality that surrounds me. And to repeat, this something is not simply a projection or my projection, nor is it an empirical part of me or a repressed part of me or anything like this. It is nothing else but a crack, a rupture, a gap in the structure that has me as its subject. The something of me that is or remains outside is precisely my lack of being there, but it is there as such. So you know that Kantian transcendental philosophy is usually presented by emphasizing the way in which it posits the transcendental subject as constitutive of objective reality, that is, of reality as we can objectively know it. So one starts with the question of the conditions of possibility of objective knowledge. And I think Lacan asks here an additional question, namely, how is it possible for something like the transcendental subject to emerge from reality? Or more precisely, what does this existence of the subject tell us about the reality from which and in which it emerges? So the relationship and mirroring of subject and objective reality is, in this perspective, twisted, complicated in two ways. It is complicated not only by the question of the Transcendental Constitution, which asks about the conditions of possibility of our knowledge, but also by the question of the conditions of possibility of the Transcendental Constitution itself. As I said, what has to happen for something like this, like transcendental subject, to emerge? But this double twist is not simply circular in the sense of like chicken and egg circle, what comes first, like one presupposing the other. I think it is kind of pushed out of this circular orbit by the discovery of the unconscious, precisely, whose eccentricity allows us to perceive this circularity in the first place. It is a place, the unconscious is a place precisely from which, it is a place within this circle, but nevertheless a point from which I can see it. We'll come back to this in a moment, but for now let me just say that this doubly twisted and eccentric circuit, it is posited by Lacan as the circuit from which truths emerge. Truths are objective, but not subjectless. For something like a subject is the condition of their objectivity, precisely, yet not exactly in the same sense as in Kant. If the subject is something that kind of performs the constitution, it is also something that results from it. This circular movement involved here is again eccentric. It involves a split. The subject of knowledge looks through the window, the frame of reality, but it is also something that exists within this frame as an impossible gaze or a slip of the tongue or whatever. It is here, at this point of these slips and discontinuities, that, of course, psychoanalysis begins its work. However, its work does not only consist in following the subjective meanders involved in these formations, but also has a more ambitious or daring epistemological, philosophical, and ontological implication. It suggests, at least this is how I would read Lacan on this question, and I come back to the announced thesis now here. It suggests that the same thing that makes possible the formations of the unconscious also makes possible objective scientific knowledge. And this something is precisely the gap, the hole that the subject bores into reality when it is constituted as subject of knowledge. For this would be my further thesis, for this gap or rupture is precisely the place in reality where the signifier, the signifying chain, can take hold of it, grasps it, so to say, enters it, and thus becomes something other than a mere reflection or symbolic rendering, symbolic reproduction of the reality. Some kind of symbolic translation, let's say, of this reality. There is, in fact, a point where actually signifiers enter nature, so to say. In other words, it is this gap or rupture that makes reality knowable, that makes it a possible object of knowledge via, of course, the signifiers. And the far-reaching implication of this is that, we could put it like this, reality in itself, an sich, reality outside the subject's relation to it, is perhaps nothing other than the same reality minus the minus. So to say, minus the lack with which and only which relates the subject which relates the subject of knowledge to reality. The transcendental constitution of reality would thus refer to the subject kind of falling out of it, but remaining there precisely as the gap left in reality. It is through this gap that we come to know something about reality by relying on signifiers. So reality in itself doesn't refer to another reality or to something that escapes its recognition or representation of it. Reality in itself is exactly the same reality minus our access, our point of entry rather, into it. The reality to which we have no access is not exactly different from ours. The more appropriate term would be indifferent. And there is a further implication, namely, if we are here talking about indifference, implication being that involvement is indeed the price of knowledge. But this does not simply mean its distortion or subjective projection. We understand reality, we know something about it, we are interested in, there is something of us that is interested here, thanks to the lack that is our impossible place in reality, the lack that we leave behind, so to speak, at the logical moment of the Constitution. It is only through this lack, again, I repeat, that the signifiers with which we scientifically or otherwise think of reality can possibly have a hold on it, have consequences in this reality. You know, that I like this quote from Lacan. This is one of my favorite examples when he says, about the moon landing, scientific discourse was able to bring about the moon landing where thought becomes witness to an eruption of a real, and with mathematics using no apparatus other than a form of language. Okay, so the psychoanalytic, or rather Lacanian concept that accounts for the fact that the possibility of objective knowledge depends in fact, on the same gap as the gap that allows for the formations of the unconscious is, I would say, the concept of desire. I've already spoken about this concept last time and one before, and I also just mentioned that involvement is the price of knowledge in a way, but desire is a much more precise formulation of this. In Lacanian theory, as it's well known, and also often criticized, an essential dimension of the concept of desire is the dimension of lack. Not this or that empirical lack, but precisely lack as constitutive lack, as the object cause of desire, different for all empirical objects of desire, or desired objects. So when we talk about the constitutive role of desire in the dimension of knowledge and truth, we are not simply talking about the desire for knowledge or desire for truth. This is something very different, but about something more fundamental. Nor are we talking about something like a capacity to desire that would precede all empirical desire. At its most fundamental level, desire is not a capacity, it is the empirical positive existence of an ontological lack of being. Desire is the way in which this lack is inscribed within the reality that exists around this lack. Embodied error was the term mentioned here. Apropos Nietzsche, here there is a kind of embodied lack in the sense that precisely makes, I think, too simplistic all this attack against the insistence on the lack in Lacan. People who say, well, we need something positive, something, but precisely this is the positive. Desire is something positive, even though it is precisely the positive existence of this. So desire is split between the object that attracts it and the negativity that drives it to desire. It is split between its object and its drive, we could say. It is not simply the desired object that drives desire. Desire is driven by a lack, by a gap in the structure from which it emerges. And an object of desire only becomes an object of desire, a desired object, when it enters the circuit, or we could say the drive tunnel that drives desire as its cause. or also we could say when it enters the frame of fantasy. Hence the difference that Lacan makes between an object cause of desire and the object of desire. However, this distinction does not mean that the object cause of desire exists somewhere else, outside what we perceive as the desired object. No, it refers to precisely a mysterious dimension of the desired objects themselves, to a mysterious something in this object more than this object. It refers to what we don't get when we get the desired object, and thus explains the eternal that is not it of desire when confronted with a particular empirical object. So no empirical object can be an adequate response to our desire, not because desire is so picky, but because it aims at something in that empirical object that is more than itself. I would suggest that it aims precisely at the very gap through which empirical objects emerge as empirical objects and come to being. A gap that is an internal quality of these objects, precisely as a gap, as a void, something that they do carry in themselves, again, as a kind of trace of constitution. Or this could be one way of understanding the famous saying also of Lacan that objet A is the void presupposed by the demand for this or that object. Okay, so I'm coming to the, I still have some time. The object cause of desire is not a phenomenal object, but neither is it a Ding an sich, a thing in itself. So what exactly is its status? I think on the basis of the arguments developed so far, we can already see in which direction we should look for an answer. Psychoanalysis is usually understood as claiming that all objects of desire appear as substitutes for the originally lost object. This also seems to be Freud's position, but could we not say that what Lacan adds here is an additional kind of philosophical speculative twist? The notion of an originally lost object implies that this loss, even if it's not empirical but structural or mythical, whatever, is something that happens to us. Even before we become ourselves, we lose something. But what follows, I think, from the Lacanian perspective is rather this, namely that the originally lost object is the subject itself, simply. The subject, let's say, before the transcendental constitution. If the Lacanian object A is the lack as object, this does not mean that what is lacking is an original object, but rather than the gap left in the constitution of the subject, gap left in reality, appears in the form of this singular, peculiar kind of object called object small a. Or to put it in a somewhat clumsy but perhaps more suggestive way, what falls out of reality when it is constituted as a possible object of knowledge is the subject as an object among other objects. The subject, we would say, okay, begins as an object. When it constitutes itself as subject, it disappears from this kind of immediate emergence into objective reality. But it disappears in such a way that it remains inscribed in it precisely as the lost object or this gap. And this, by the way, I think also is why the supposedly humble attempts of some of the new ontologies to situate the subject back in reality and to conceptualize the subject as just another kind of object among a multitude of objects are in fact phantasmatic now in this other sense of the term fantasy scenario and so on, and also in this sense kind of bursting with subjectivism despite all of the object-oriented rhetoric that usually accompanies them. Namely, they imply this properly phantasmatic possibility of seeing oneself and seeing oneself, this kind of multiplications of the points of view which are precisely what defines fantasy also in Freud and in this kind of, there is this play of gazes in which you can see yourself seeing yourself. And I think this is precisely what obscures the division, the splitting, this multitude of viewpoints is what obscures the division, the splitting of the subject, as well as the impossibility that takes place in its constitution, in the constitution of the subject. For Lacan, this impossibility is the real, it is the limit of the transcendental constitution. But it is precisely this real as limit that makes our necessarily symbolic relation to reality something more than just a discursive cage with no access to, let's say, the great outside. For this impossible real, which is now actually, which is how the great outside exists on the inside, makes this inside precisely not all or cracks it open in a certain way. So, okay, I'm going very fast now, so excuse me if this will now be a kind of, if the concept of the subject is irreducible, it is because I think it constitutes the only possible path to objectivity, other than the purely subjective assertion of reality's independent existence and richness. Why the only path? Does the answer sketched above not rather suggest that we are indeed irredeemably and claustrophobically condemned to our subjective or discursive cage? Does it not suggest that as subjects of desire, in all the empirical objects we pursue, we are in fact only pursuing and desiring, ourselves? No, not exactly, for we don't chase ourselves in any meaningful sense of this word. We chase and are driven by our lack of being. And this impossible chase is the very ground, the field of objectivity. Without this subjective inclination that kind of hollows the reality from the inside, produces this vacuum that is kind of productive, the field of objectivity would remain, indifferent and therefore inaccessible to any knowledge, or indifferent to truth. In its structure, desire is the form that informs us of this gap and asymmetry. And this further implies that we need fantasy to correlate any object with our desire, and that this does not happen naturally. The subject's natural correlate in the word is lack, and not my other half. Or we could perhaps turn the Platonic myth around and say that my other half is precisely the lack of being. Therefore, even if, as Lacan puts it, fantasy is a window to reality for everyone, chacun, it does not simply mean that everyone sees reality in their own way, or that everyone has their own reality or lives in it and so on. Particularity or singularity refers, I would say, to the meaning that this primordial loss, which opens access to reality as something out there to which we can relate, the meaning that this obtains or has for each subject. It does not refer to reality as such, although, of course, pathological distortions can and certainly do occur with regard also to the functioning of the said meaning attributed to the originally missing piece. However, this does not make things inaccessible per se or in principle. As a clinical practice, psychoanalysis operates mostly in the realm of the meanings that the originally lost object acquires for the subject. It operates in the direction of bringing this meaning also to its meaningless limit, to the point of the real. And this clinical focus, I think, does not imply that psychoanalysis cannot or should not or cannot make claims about reality, subjectivity, knowledge, truth in the sense that Lacan does. Not simply because it has as much right to do so as any philosophy, but because, this is my claim, a philosophical or speculative claim is inscribed in the very foundation of both psychoanalytic theory and practice. And to repeat and conclude with this claim would be, suggest that the same thing that allows for the formation of the unconscious to occur by all this signifying place, interfering with drives and so on, is also what allows scientific knowledge to exist. And this something is the whole the subject bores in reality when it is constituted as the subject of, let's say, representation. This does not deny the obvious difference between the formations of the unconscious and the forms of scientific knowledge, but it does point to their common origin or condition. And this common origin or condition forces us, this would be a very modest conclusion, forces us to reconsider, rethink, reconceptualize some of the traditional scientific and philosophical divisions, starting, of course, with that between the subjective and the objective. Not in order to relativize the objective validity of scientific or other claims, or abolish the subjective-objective divide, but rather to formulate it in the light of this eccentricism and asymmetry that characterize the relationship and topology. So the gap or difference between the objective and the subjective certainly exists, or it is real, but it only exists because there is something as a subject that makes it possible. Makes it possible without making it merely subjective. Okay, thank you very much. I know this was for me.
Thank you, Alenka, for this really brilliant, wonderful paper. We have, I think, kind of 10 to 15 minutes for questions and comments.
Thank you, Alenka. Really wonderful paper, and as you said, there's so many things that could be said that, you know, don't go without saying. But anyway, thank you. I just want to pick up on two of them because I think that in terms of a kind of Kantian appraisal of Lacan, they would both sort of be necessary to not only just to do this, but actually to motivate why it would be the case. So almost on either side of the schematism, so to speak. One is that I think, especially the, you know, what you discuss as the sort of, you know, the third element in the rapport of me as subject with supposed objectivity out there that is makes possible the schematism. I mean, Kant, I think, has a very good actually account of this in the A deduction, as and it's surprising perhaps, but substantiates this point of the synthesis of imagination, right? Because in some sense it can be taken actually. It's very close to what Lacan ends up doing, I think, with der einzige Zug. Like because if you think about it. Pure apprehension is just like einzige Zug over here, einzige Zug over here, I mean, ontogenetically speaking. And then it's actually by a synthesis of the imagination that one is constituted as supposedly the first. You know, they're just pure letters, letterness, and its signifier only gets hooked on insofar as there's that synthesis. So that's first point that I find very crucial, and then why don't we keep it there then? But okay, yeah. So.
Okay, no, I think I will just answer your question in this more general way, not really trying to avoid it. I know that, I mean, even though at some point I thought it would go more in this direction, but as you saw, this paper was not at all finally about any kind of serious comparison or even encounter between Kant and Lacan, the way they put it. It was basically, it was more really this question that is also in the title, is what Lacan conceptualized as fantasy something that kind of resonates, let's say, with this question of transcendental constitution, without going into many, many further subtle things that one could say in relationship to Kant that has already been said in relationship to Kant. Not only you are right to point at this question of imagination, there is also the question of the this X, this Kantian transcendental subject, which precisely is also not really noumenal nor phenomenal, the it that thinks, you know, the is, what is this quote, the I or X that thinks. I mean, this relationship would be much more fascinating to explore in detail. What I wanted to present here is actually a thesis which is nevertheless Lacanian. I mean, I'm not, in spite of these proximities and even things that are kind of cover each other, I still think there is a difference between the Lacanian precisely based on this discovery of the unconscious thing and the Kantian conception. So, and I was more interested in trying to present, let's say, the Lacan's case here. But obviously, any further elaboration of this would need to go, and some parts were already there and I cut them out concerning this interesting question of the also comparison and how far one can actually think with Kant also in this direction. Yeah.
Thank you, Alenka. That was a wonderful paper. I just had two very quick questions, and I'll put them as telegraphically as possible. The first one is, what do you think the argument that you proposed would, you know, what kind of consequences would this argument have for science? And because you were talking about scientific knowledge, in a sense, being constituted by the subject. That's the first question. What kind of consequences would this argument have for science? And the second is about, I know you were not talking about the real, but that crack in reality opened up, in a sense, and that which, in fact, opens up the subject, made me think about the distinction that Lacan makes between lack in the symbolic and whole in the real, in Seminar 10, but in 23, again, it all becomes this logic of the point and the whole. So I was just wondering whether the real has something to do with this operation that you described there. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. Absolutely. I mean, again, I'm really sorry because there are so many things and so many directions into which things would need to be further developed. One is definitely this whole leg distinction, which was already made by Miller, and Slavoj also had some very interesting things. So whole as something that pertains to the real and leg, which is already symbolized. Although here, I think that what is interesting for me is that, in a way, perhaps we could use another term already used here, that desire is a kind of Grenzbegriff here, because in a way, one leg is in the real and the other is in the symbolic. And it's so it's also, these distinctions are interesting and important, but sometimes it's also interesting to see how things kind of, overlap. So the real was the only way I tried to introduce this real here is precisely via this notion of the also, whole, but also the impossibility as inherent limit, not the impossible out there or something that is already here and already productive of the outside as it is. So we don't need to wait or hope for this real to arrive. Real, as I put it also some other paper, real is not impossible to happen, it is the impossible that happens in Lacan. It's not simply, oh, this is something that will never take place or cannot take place. It takes place as real, and when it does, it is shattering,
I have a quick question about your talk of a split in nature itself, and it seems to suggest the idea of if there are, we could call them meta-transcendental conditions, the conditions of possibility for the Kantian transcendental subject. One thing that I was wondering about is, it called to mind for me, so the early Wittgenstein in the Tractatus, at one point in his very succinct way, observes that the I, not the first person pronoun, but the eyeball, the eyeball cannot fall within its own visual field. And he, and it very much seems to be, line up nicely with, say, Kant's paralogisms of pure reason in the first critique, but in a way where it's tied directly inherently to the body, that there's something in terms of the actual physical constitution of the organism itself, which introduces this split in terms of the impossibility of the physical enabler of the visual field becoming an object within its own visual field, right? And I'm wondering, in terms of specifying the idea of nature and the split in it that you have in view, would this be, the kind of, this kind of Wittgensteinian observation? Would this be in the spirit of what you have in mind, or is it, a different conception of nature and division within it that that's in the background here?
No, I think you are very right to ask this question also, because this quote that I read, I mean, again, not enough time to, it's very ambiguous. I actually modified the translation a little bit, because it could also be read that as something like this split already exists in nature, in the sense of, because Lacan goes on discussing mimicry as also splitting, of the what being adopts itself to. So clearly, it's not necessarily related to the subjectivity in the sense that I discussed it. But nevertheless, I think the English translation, which is different from what I said, it's. I can read you the French quote, which is. Nous partons pour notre part de ce fait qu'il y a quelque chose qui instaure une fracture, une bipartition, une schise de l'être à quoi celui-ci s'accommode dès la nature. So it is, you can say, okay, nature also has this phenomena, which would be a legitimate way of reading this, but I think, I don't know, for me, I thought that it's not too much of a stretch to also say that this indicates precisely, points to this kind of a split in reality to which the subjectivity adapts in a way. But the whole question that you also raised of the visual metaphors involved here, as opposed to perhaps other kinds, I think this is something that is at the center of the seminar 11. I mean, this is why the whole preoccupation with the gaze, and it's I don't know, one would need to think further about it, or the mirror stage, which again, it's a kind of, this all has to do with the spatial visual mapping of the space and ourselves in it. But on the other hand, most of the psychotic hallucinations are sonor or something, which is a different way in which this reality, I don't have, it is a very good question. I don't have, but definitely it's a model which is also easy to represent, because it is like these visual metaphors themselves are a metaphor. We are kind of perhaps going around in this circle of representation, but nevertheless, while using the representation, being able to catch something what precisely falls out here. But
Okay, is there anybody else? Okay. There is a hand.
Thank you very much for the talk. What about destitution, symbolic destitution? We said transcendental constitution of reality. Could we make the link that the analytic act is something along the lines of making that loss of reality, which tests the reality?
I think, destitution, if you are referring to this Lacanian, one of the possible endings of analysis being defined as the destitution of the subject and so on, if this is what you're, this is again something that I very just briefly wrote but left out, what actually happens in analysis. It's not simply the conclusion from there would not be that all in all we are kind of condemned to fantasy also in the sense that, this is, or else the world falls apart. That there is something about the analytic work which precisely always remains or almost always remains on this edge of a reality collapsing completely, and something that still remains functional, that can, this I guess is the ideal or the idea, that can in fact orientate us in this phantasmatic reality, make it possible for us to orientate ourselves in it in a different way than simply this phantasmatic way. So that there is something that happens. This again would need much more elaboration, but not simply directly embracing the destitution. This is simply this is. But obviously there is something in the process of analytic work that kind of performs this destitution in a way that does not lead to Realitätsverlust, but nevertheless kind of opens some perspectives from within this phantasmatic framework that are not saturated, let's say, by this phantasmatic frame. But I don't know, it's so, yes, destitution of the subject is an important theme which would need to demand at least one additional paper. But it's not. If this was the question, my idea was not okay. We are condemned to this. There are ways of working with this, and I guess literature does this as well. I mean, fiction is for Lacan. Why it is one of the ways in which truth exists. It is not something that is not immediate. That does not immediately constitute or destitute us, but that nevertheless it's a work to be done which at some point led you to throw out something that perhaps keeps blinding you for certain effects of the structure without simply, and it's that destitutes you in this way, but you don't simply lose it, so to say. So, but okay, this is a very rough or whatever approximate description of what would the ideal be, but there are analysts here who could perhaps address this question of destitution more direct. Sorry?
I was exactly speaking from a clinical perspective. Okay. Thanks, Alenka, again.
Thank you.